Hello, everyone. Here we are in our fourth week of Narratives of the Old Testament, and we are zipping through the Old Testament. One of the things that I want you to remember as we read the narratives that we do and the commentary in the textbooks that we're reading is that we're talking about narratives that have to do with the shaping of Israel's identity as the people of God. And we started out by looking at the understanding that the Hebrews had of the creation, which differs significantly from the other stories of creation of the nations around them. We saw how they understood God much differently than the other gods of the other peoples, how they understood the relationship of God to human beings much differently in the sense that God delights in his creation, that God didn't make human beings to be his personal slaves, and that he gave human beings an exalted position in the taking care of what he had created. Then you saw how the Hebrews understood the entrance of evil and sin in the world. And we see that specifically in when we look at the garden and the fall, what we call Christians call the fall, and the areas that were affected by the choices that Adam and Eve made. That first of all, the relationship with God was definitely broken. The relationship between human beings was broken as you saw Adam blame Eve and Eve blame the serpent. And you saw that their relationship with the world, the material world that God created, was also broken because now Adam will be working, gaining his livelihood by the sweat of his brow, and Eve would experience difficulty in childbirth. So all around, the relationships and every turn were broken by sin, by the fall. Then there's a long stretch where we read about Abraham, how God has, in some way that we can't clearly identify, God chose Abraham, and Abraham became then the father of the nation of Israel. He was given promises by God. He was promised that he would be the father of many nations. He was promised that through him, all nations of the world would be blessed. And he was promised land, a place of his own. And that promise, I want you to understand that when God promised Abraham this, he wasn't saying to Abraham, because I like you more than everybody else, you're going to get more goodies than anybody else. He was choosing a people who would become the means by which all the world and all peoples would be blessed. So Abraham was chosen to be a blessing to other nations, just as the Hebrew people then were to be a blessing to other nations. And as we continue the story, then Abraham is crucial in their understanding of who they are, of their sense of being called, of their sense of purpose. And we see through the stories in Genesis how they ended up in Egypt as slaves to Pharaoh, working for Pharaoh under very difficult conditions. And even though the question seemed unrealistic about what were the benefits of slavery, I want you to remember that when the Israelites finally did leave Egypt, there was a point in their wandering in the desert when they actually wanted to go back to Egypt and to slavery, because slavery seemed more sure, more certain. They would have food, they would have housing, and they would have uh, uh, a place to be protected. So there were benefits that they interpreted or they saw perhaps after the fact. Now, of course, I'm not saying that slavery is a good thing. Of course, it's not. But it demonstrates their lack of security as they were wandering in the desert, and their fearfulness that they would not be taken care of, at least as slaves. And they say this in if when you read through the Old Testament, there are places that they think about the food that they had to eat in Egypt, and they got tired of what God was providing for them in the desert. And even though God had brought them out of Egypt in a miraculous way, and Moses was leading them, and he was providing water for them out of the rock, the manna from heaven, that they got tired of that. They wanted all the good things that they had in Egypt. So it demonstrates the level of insecurity that they were experiencing, that they hadn't yet come to fully trust God to take care of their needs. We come to Moses now, and part of the story of Moses, of course, is the fact that God gave Moses laws. We think of them as the Ten Commandments, but there were lots of other laws about the kinds of foods they could eat, the priesthood, how the priesthood would operate, uh, all the things that went along with their worship. The laws were necessary because they had been living under Pharaoh's laws, and Pharaoh was God in Egypt. They were coming into a relationship with God, with the true God, with a different kind of relationship that required different kinds of laws. And here God is reestablishing the way to maintain not only good relationship with him, but also good relationships with each other, and then, of course, in taking care of the material world. So the laws were important, and the laws also set them apart from the other nations around them, because their laws were based on the worship of God. It wasn't over here is our worship, and over here is the way we live. The fact that the worship of God meant and implied that they would also treat each other with the kinds of respect and concern that the Mosaic Law outlines. So they're gradually coming into a sense, a more detailed or defined sense of what the people of God should look like. And the people of God should look like people who first of all worship God with all of their hearts, speak the truth, don't steal, don't murder, don't covet, are satisfied with what they have been given, and they rest. They rest from their labor because they have a God who takes care of them, and so they do not have to work 24/7. This is a huge thing in our culture today, this concept of actually resting from labor as a means of demonstrating trust. I truly believe that taking the Sabbath rest seriously is a means of demonstrating to the rest of the world that we trust that God will take care of us. So that's where we come from. Now you're going to come into the stories of Saul and David and Solomon, because the Israelites, as they begin to establish themselves in their own land, decide that they want to be like everybody else and have a king. So you have the story of that coming up. Now this week you don't have any written work to do. The reading is kind of heavy that you have in The World and the Word, that textbook, because it's talking about what inspiration means. And while that textbook is very good, I want you to remember as you read it that that is not the only way that we can look at inspiration of the Old Testament. However, the discussion around how the writing of the Old Testament came about is really important. It's heavy going. Stick with it. It will help you understand how the Old Testament really did come together. Then you have the story in the other reading, the story of how Saul becomes the first king, how he fails, how David then comes, how you have the United Kingdom, and then Solomon building the temple. That's what you have for this week. And even though you don't have a written assignment, what I would like you to do, if you want to earn 10 extra points that will be added on to your final grade, I would like you to send me an email. To send me an email that says, one thing I am learning from this course is whatever. If you send me that email, you automatically get 10 points, and I will add it on to when I come to doing the final grade. One thing I am learning in this course is, doesn't have to be a lengthy email. It can be a paragraph. It can be a couple of sentences, but enough that gives me a sense of what you are actually learning. And it could be an affirmation of what you've already learned in other places, but something that gives me an indication that there is something that you're getting from this course. So that's all that I have for you. And of course, if you have any questions, be sure and let me know, and continue the good work. I look forward to reading your Exodus papers, especially. Until next week, then.